At the age of 67, every night my daughter and her husband came to my house. They threatened to prove me mentally unstable and send me to a mental asylum if I refused to give them money. Hello, my dear listeners. Before I begin my story, I would be very happy if you subscribe and hit the like button. Please write in the comments which city or country you are listening from. Now enjoy the story. At the age of 67, I was living alone in my old house, spending a quiet life on the money I had saved over 30 years as a nurse. Quiet. That word used to comfort me. My house stood on a calm street where mornings arrived slowly and nights did not rush. It was not a big house and it was not new. The paint on the walls had softened with time, and the wooden floor creaked gently when I walked across it. But it was mine. Every inch of it carried my breath, my footsteps, my patience. I woke up without alarms. No hospital bells. No urgent calls. Just the soft light of morning, slipping through the curtains like it was asking permission to enter. I would sit on the edge of my bed for a few moments, letting my knees remember how to move. Age teaches your body to negotiate with time, not fight it. In the kitchen, I boiled water for tea. The kettle's sound filled the silence, and I liked that sound. It reminded me that something was still working properly. I would hold the warm cup with both hands and sit by the window, watching the world wake up without needing me. That was new. And it was peaceful. For more than 30 years, my life had belonged to other people's emergencies. I worked as a nurse in a private hospital, where days and nights blended into each other. I learned how to stand for hours without sitting, how to smile even when my feet burned, how to listen when someone was scared and needed a calm voice. I worked weekends, holidays, nights when the city slept and the hospital never did. I saved slowly, carefully, quietly. Every paycheck I put something aside. Not because anyone told me to, but because I understood something early in life. Freedom costs money. And I wanted freedom in my old age. I wanted to choose when to wake up, when to rest, when to be silent. That savings became my safety. When I finally stopped working, my body felt tired, but my heart felt proud. I had done my part. I had given my strength to my work, and now it was time to give myself peace. Living alone did not scare me. It felt earned. During the day, I cleaned slowly. I didn't rush anymore. I dusted shelves that held photographs, faces frozen in time, smiling at moments that had already passed. I talked to those photographs sometimes, not out loud, just inside my heart. At night, I locked my doors, turned off the lights, and went to bed with a book or the radio playing softly. Silence wrapped around the house like a blanket. I slept deeply. At least I used to, because silence has different meanings at different ages. When you are young, silence feels empty. When you are old, silence feels full of memories, of thoughts, of questions. Some nights I lay awake thinking about my long shifts at the hospital. The faces I remembered, the hands I held when people were afraid. I wondered how many people remembered me now. But those thoughts never frightened me. They were gentle. They passed like clouds. I believed I was safe. I believed my quiet life was stable. I believed the hardest part was behind me. I did not know that quiet could change its shape, that the same silence I trusted would one day start listening back. There were moments, small ones, when I noticed my house felt different. The hallway seemed longer at night. The ticking clock sounded louder. I would pause and listen, just for a second, before reminding myself that I was alone by choice. I told myself that independence sometimes feels like loneliness. And loneliness sometimes feels heavy, but that doesn't mean it is dangerous. I trusted my judgment. After all, I had spent a lifetime making decisions under pressure. I had comforted strangers in their weakest moments. I had stayed calm when others panicked. I believed age had given me wisdom, not weakness. On one particular evening, I stood in my living room and looked around. The couch where I rested my tired legs. The lamp that gave off warm light. The front door strong and closed. I remember thinking, I have everything I need. That thought stayed with me, because sometimes the moment before change feels exactly like peace. Every night at exactly 1 a.m., my daughter Linda and her husband Mark came to my door and filled my home with fear. The first night it happened, I remember checking the clock twice. 1 a.m., not 12:58. Not 105. Exactly 1 ma. The sound was not loud, but it was firm. A knock that expected an answer. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly awake before my body was. For a moment, I stayed still, listening. Old houses speak at night, pipes, wood, wind. But this sound was different. It was deliberate. I wrapped my robe around myself and walked slowly toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than it should have. When I reached the door and looked through the small window, my breath tightened. Linda was standing there. My daughter. Behind her stood Mark, his face half hidden by the porch light. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the door like he was waiting for it to obey him. I opened the door. "Mom," Linda said, her voice flat. "We need to come in." There was no warmth in her tone. No apology for the hour. No concern for my sleep. She stepped inside before I could respond. Mark followed, closing the door behind him with a careful, quiet motion that somehow felt louder than a slam. That was the moment my house stopped feeling like mine. They didn't sit right away. Linda walked slowly through the living room, her eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the shelves. Mark stood near the door, silent as if guarding it. "It's late," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Is everything okay?" Linda turned toward me and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We were just worried about you," she said. Worried. That word should have comforted me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. She sat down on the couch. Mark finally moved, choosing the chair closest to the door. They didn't ask me to sit. They didn't ask how I was feeling. They didn't ask anything that mattered. Linda folded her hands in her lap and looked at me like she was studying a patient. "You live alone," she said slowly. "Yes," I replied. "I've told you that." She nodded. "At your age, that can be challenging." I felt something shift inside me, a small quiet warning. "I manage fine," I said. Mark cleared his throat. It was the first sound he made. "Things change," he said. "People notice." "Notice what?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't. They stayed for less than 15 minutes that night. No shouting. No clear reason for being there. Just words that hovered in the air like smoke. Hard to see. Harder to breathe through. When they left, I locked the door and stood there for a long time. My hand still on the lock. I told myself it was nothing. But the next night at exactly 1 a.m., the knock came again. This time I didn't need to check the clock. My body already knew. Fear learned schedules quickly. Linda and Mark stood there again, in the same positions, like they had rehearsed it. I let them in, my heart beating faster than the night before. They walked in like they belonged. Linda sat in the same spot. Mark stood, then sat, then stood again. He paced slowly, his shoes making soft sounds against the floor. "You seem tired," Linda said. "I didn't sleep well," I answered. She nodded, as if confirming something she already believed. They didn't stay long again. But when they left, my house felt colder, larger, louder in its silence. On the third night, I almost didn't open the door. I stood behind it, listening to the knock echo through my chest. I thought about pretending I wasn't home, about staying silent. But then I imagined Linda's voice the next day. "We knocked. You didn't answer." So I opened the door. Each night after that followed the same pattern. 1 a.m. Knock. Their presence. Their quiet observation. They never raised their voices. That was the part that confused me the most. There was no obvious anger, no clear accusation, just questions and comments that made me feel smaller. "Do you remember what day it is?" "You've lost weight." "This house is very quiet." Mark watched me closely. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it felt deliberate. "Silence can be dangerous," he said one night. I didn't know what he meant, but I felt it. I started leaving a light on at night. Then another. I stopped sleeping deeply. I lay awake, waiting for the knock, my heart racing before it came. My quiet life was changing shape. The same silence I once trusted now felt like it was holding its breath. One night after they left, I walked through my house, touching the walls, the table, the back of the couch, like I needed to remind myself that these things were real, that I was still here. I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Why do they only come at night? The answer scared me more than the question, because night makes people doubt themselves, and doubt is easy to control. That thought stayed with me after Linda and Mark left that night. I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The ticking clock felt louder than usual, as if it was counting something I didn't want to reach. The next night, I didn't bother making tea. I didn't turn on the radio. I sat in the living room with one lamp on, waiting. At exactly 1 a.m., the knock came. This time, my body reacted before my mind. My hands grew cold. My mouth felt dry. I stood up slowly, already knowing who it would be. When I opened the door, Linda didn't greet me. She walked straight in. Mark followed, closing the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in my chest. He didn't sit down. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching me like I was standing on a thin edge. Linda sat on the couch and looked around, then back at me. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk seriously tonight." The word seriously carried weight. I sat down across from her. My knees felt weak, but I didn't want them to see it. Linda sighed, like she was tired of explaining something obvious. "We've noticed things," she said. "What things?" I asked. She tilted her head. "You forget small details. You live alone. You don't have anyone checking on you." "I'm fine," I said quickly. Mark pushed himself off the wall and took a slow step forward. "That's what people always say," he said. "Right before things go wrong." Linda leaned in closer. Her voice lowered. "Mom, if someone reports concerns, doctors have to listen." The room felt smaller. "Concerns about what?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "About your mental state," she finally said. The words hit me hard. "I'm not—" I started, but she raised her hand. "You don't get to decide that alone," she said calmly. "That's how the system works." System? That word scared me more than anything else. Mark nodded. "Once paperwork starts, it moves fast." I felt my heart pounding in my ears. "Why are you telling me this?" Linda's eyes stayed on mine. "Because we're trying to protect you." "Protect!" The word sounded wrong coming from her mouth. She continued. "If a doctor thinks you're unstable, they can recommend a facility." My breath caught. "A facility?" Mark answered this time. "A place where you're supervised." I shook my head slowly. "I don't need that." Linda sighed again. "Mom, denial is common." Denial. I felt something inside me crack. I had worked my whole life taking care of others. I knew what real confusion looked like. I knew what real illness sounded like. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this wasn't that. But sitting there, alone with them at night, their words began to wrap around my thoughts. What if someone believes them? A small voice inside me whispered. Linda stood up and walked around the room slowly. She touched the back of a chair, looked at a framed photograph on the wall. "This house," she said casually, "is a lot to manage." I didn't respond. Mark added, "Stress makes things worse." Linda stopped walking and faced me. "There are ways to avoid all this trouble," she said. I looked at her. "What ways?" She met my eyes. "Cooperation." The word hung in the air. That night, they didn't ask for anything specific. They didn't need to. The threat had already done its work. When they left, my legs gave out, and I had to sit down on the floor. I pressed my back against the couch and hugged my knees like a child. I told myself to breathe. The next day, I moved through my house like a guest. I second-guessed everything. I checked the stove twice. I reread the same page of my book again and again without understanding it. At night, I waited. 1 a.m. Knock. This time, Linda didn't sit down. "You've had time to think," she said. Mark stood beside her. "I don't understand what you want," I said quietly. Linda crossed her arms. "Peace." "How?" I asked. She looked at me carefully. "We can help you manage things." "Manage what?" "Your responsibilities," Mark said. Linda stepped closer. "Your money." My stomach dropped. "You don't need to handle all that stress," she continued. "We can take care of it for you." "No," I said without thinking. Mark's expression hardened. "Then you leave us no choice." "No choice for what?" I asked, my voice shaking. Linda looked at the door, then back at me. To make sure you get proper care. That night, the threat became real. Not loud. Not violent. Just certain. I slept less after that. I started keeping notes, small things I did during the day, just to prove to myself that I still remembered. I replayed their words again and again in my head. Doctors, paperwork, facility. I wondered who they would believe. One night after they left, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my face closely. The lines, the tired eyes, the gray hair. Am I really losing myself? I whispered. The silence didn't answer. And that was the most frightening part. The silence didn't answer. I stood there for a long time, staring at my reflection, waiting for something inside me to speak. But nothing did. Only the clock in the hallway ticked, steady and uncaring, like it had no idea what was happening inside these walls. That night, I didn't go back to bed. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the front door. Every sound made me flinch. The refrigerator humming, the wind brushing against the windows, my own breathing. I had always believed fear was loud. I was wrong. Fear is quiet. Fear sits with you. Fear waits. The next day passed slowly. I tried to keep my routine the same. I made tea. I opened the curtains. I read a few pages of a book, though the words slid past my eyes without staying. My thoughts kept circling one question. What happens if they really do it? What happens if someone believes them? What happens if a stranger decides I am no longer capable? What happens if my voice no longer matters? By evening, my chest felt tight. I ate very little. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want noise. Noise made thinking harder. I already knew what time it was when I heard the knock. 1 a.m. It sounded firmer this time, confident, like the door was expected to open. When I unlocked it, Linda and Mark walked in without a word. Linda didn't sit. Mark didn't pace. They both stood in front of me, close enough that I could smell the night air on their clothes. Linda spoke first. You look tired, Mom. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Mark glanced around the room. Stress does that. Linda tilted her head. Have you thought about what we said? Yes, I whispered. And? She asked. I swallowed. My throat felt dry. I don't want trouble. Her eyes softened just a little. Not with kindness, but with satisfaction. Then let us help you, she said. How? I asked, even though part of me already knew. She stepped closer. By taking some of the pressure off you. Mark added, you shouldn't be managing everything alone. Linda's voice dropped lower. Especially your finances. There it was, clear, direct, no more shadows. I felt my heart beat harder. My money is fine. Linda smiled gently, the way she used to when she wanted something as a child. You worked hard for it, she said. But managing money at your age can be confusing. Confusing. That word again. I'm not confused, I said, trying to sound firm. Mark sighed. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? I asked. Linda held my gaze. Security. She paused, letting the words sink in. If someone sees you struggling, she continued, they might step in. We don't want that. My hands started to tremble. I tried to steady them by pressing them together, but the shaking only grew worse. I tucked them into my sleeves, embarrassed by my own body betraying me. Linda noticed. You see? She said softly. You're already overwhelmed. Something inside me wanted to scream, to stand up, to tell them to leave. But fear pressed down on my chest, heavy and cold. What do you want? I asked. Linda didn't hesitate. We'll hold on to some money for you. How much? I asked. Mark answered. Enough to keep things smooth. My stomach turned. And if I say no? I whispered. Linda's face hardened. Then we worry. About what? I asked, though my voice shook. She looked at the door, then back at me. About your well-being? The room felt smaller, the walls closer. I thought about hospitals, about locked doors, about being told when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. I thought about losing my house, my keys, my choices. I stood up slowly and walked toward the small drawer in the hallway. The one where I kept my savings, neatly organized, counted carefully over the years. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pause. Linda and Mark didn't follow me. They didn't need to. They knew where I was going. I opened the drawer. The money looked different that night, heavier, sadder, like it knew what it was being used for. I counted slowly, my fingers trembling, my breath uneven. Each bill felt like a piece of my independence tearing away. When I turned around and handed it to Linda, I couldn't look at her face. She took it without hesitation. "Good," she said. "This is for your own good." Mark nodded once. They left soon after. The door closed. The lock clicked, and I slid down the wall onto the floor. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shaking. My chest hurt. My head felt light. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. That night I didn't sleep at all. The next day my body felt heavy, like I was moving through water. I replayed the night again and again in my mind. I gave them my money. The thought tasted bitter. That night at 1 a.m. they came again. This time I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. My hands began to shake the moment I saw them. Linda watched carefully. "You're doing the right thing," she said. I went to the drawer, counted, handed it over. Night after night, it became a ritual. The knock, the fear, the shaking hands, the money leaving my house. I stopped buying small comforts for myself. I stopped fixing things around the house. I told myself it was temporary. That peace was worth the price. But peace never came. Only more fear. Each night I felt myself shrinking a little more, speaking less, thinking twice before every word, questioning my own memory. Sometimes after they left, I would sit alone and whisper, "You are still here. You are still you." But even my own voice sounded unsure. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet thought began to form, small, almost invisible. How long can this go on? That question followed me into the days, into the nights, into every quiet moment of my life. For 3 long years, fear became my routine. It didn't arrive suddenly anymore. It lived with me. It sat beside me while I drank my tea. It stood behind me when I washed dishes. It lay awake with me when the house went dark. Every night I listened, not just for the knock, but for everything. The wind brushing the windows, a car slowing down outside, footsteps that might not even be real. My body learned to wake up before 1 a.m. I didn't need an alarm. My eyes would open on their own, my heart already beating fast, as if it was reminding me what time it was. Some nights, I sat in the living room with the lamp on, waiting. Other nights I stayed in bed, staring at the door, counting my breaths. When the knock came, it always felt like confirmation. You were right to be afraid. Linda and Mark didn't change their routine. Neither did I. They came. They spoke calmly. They waited. I stopped asking questions. I went to the drawer. I counted the money. I handed it over. My hands shook every time. Sometimes Linda watched closely, her eyes narrowing slightly, like she was checking something. Mark rarely spoke. When he did, it was short. "Good. That's fine. We'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. That word lost its meaning. Days blurred into each other. Weeks passed without notice. Months folded into silence. I stopped marking dates on the calendar. I stopped inviting anyone over. The idea of explaining my life felt exhausting. I didn't want questions. I didn't want concern. Concern led to attention, and attention felt dangerous. My world became very small. I moved through my house quietly, like a guest afraid of making noise. I double-checked everything: locks, switches, notes I left for myself. I started writing things down. Turned off stove. Locked door. Paid bills. Not because I forgot, but because I was afraid of being told that I did. At night, after Linda and Mark left, I often sat on the floor back against the wall, listening to the silence settle again. Silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. Some nights I whispered to myself, "You're still here," I would say. "You're still thinking. You're still you." But the words felt thinner each time. My body felt older, heavier, not from age, but from stress. My shoulders stayed tense. My jaw hurt from clenching. Sleep came in short pieces, never deep, never kind. I dreamed about doors I couldn't open, rooms without windows, voices calling my name from far away. I woke up tired. During the day, I tried to act normal. I smiled at neighbors. I nodded politely. But inside, I was counting hours. How many hours until night? I began to dread sunsets. The sky turning dark felt like a warning. I closed my curtains early. I locked my doors earlier than necessary. I told myself it was just caution. But deep down, I knew it was fear. There were nights when Linda stayed longer. She would sit and talk about nothing important. Weather, errands, small complaints, all while Mark stood quietly watching me. Those nights were the worst. Because it felt like they were studying me. I noticed changes in myself. I hesitated before answering simple questions. I checked the clock too often. I jumped at sudden sounds. Once I dropped a cup in the kitchen. The sound shattered my calm. I stood there shaking, staring at the broken pieces, my heart racing. What if they see this? I thought. The idea scared me more than the broken glass. 3 years. 3 years of giving money. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of wondering if tonight would be worse than the last. Sometimes I thought about telling someone, anyone. But fear stopped me. What if they don't believe me? What if it makes things worse? Linda had planted that doubt carefully, slowly, repeatedly. I began to question my own reactions. Am I overreacting? Is this really happening? That kind of doubt is dangerous. It doesn't shout. It whispers. One night, after Linda and Mark left, I didn't sit on the floor. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. The same couch. The same lamp. The same walls. Everything looked normal. And that terrified me because nothing about my life felt normal anymore. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street was quiet, peaceful. No sign of what was happening inside my house. That's when I realized something painful. From the outside, I looked fine. No one could see the fear. No one could hear the knock. No one could feel my shaking hands. I was alone with it. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for sleep that didn't come, a thought formed, slowly, carefully. If this continues, it will never stop. The idea settled deep in my chest, and with it came another thought. Small, fragile, almost hopeful. I cannot survive another 3 years like this. The clock ticked. The house breathed. And somewhere inside me, something very quiet began to wake up. I lay awake long after midnight, watching shadows move across the ceiling. The clock had passed 1 a.m., but the knock didn't come that night. For the first time in years, the silence felt heavier than their voices. It felt like waiting for something that would never arrive. And strangely, that scared me even more. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from too many sleepless nights. My heart was still racing, as if it hadn't realized the fear could rest. That's when the thought returned. The one that had whispered inside. Me the night before. If this continues, it will never stop. I whispered it again, out loud this time, just to hear my own voice. The sound surprised me. I hadn't heard it spoken with strength in years. I turned on the small lamp beside my chair and looked at my reflection in the glass cabinet. My face looked thinner, my eyes tired but alive. I realized that fear had taken so much from me. Money, sleep, confidence, but not my will. Not yet. That realization sat in my chest like a spark. It wasn't bright, but it was warm enough to make me move. The next morning, I opened the curtains fully for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled across the floor, sharp and clean. I blinked against it, and for a second I felt almost human again. I made tea. Strong tea. As the steam rose, I thought of names. People from my past who had known me before fear changed me. There weren't many left. Most had moved, retired, vanished into their own quiet lives. But one name stayed in my mind. Ruth. I hadn't spoken to her in years. We had met at the hospital. She worked with the police, handling medical files for cases. Back then, she was the kind of woman who walked into chaos and brought order. I had admired her strength. Now I needed that strength. I stared at the phone for almost an hour before picking it up. My fingers hesitated above the buttons. What would I even say after all these years? Would she remember me? Would she believe me? Fear tried to stop me. It whispered that I would sound foolish, that I would make things worse. But another voice, quieter and steadier, pushed back. You have survived worse. I dialed. The ringing felt endless. Then a click. Hello? Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Low, calm, no nonsense. Ruth, I said softly. There was a pause. Who's this? It's me, Evelyn. Silence. Then warmth. Evelyn, my goodness, it's been years. Are you all right? That question broke something inside me. My throat tightened. No, I whispered. No, I'm not. She didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence. She just waited. And for the first time in 3 years, someone waited for me. Words started tumbling out. I told her everything. The nightly knocks, the threats, the money, the fear, the shaking hands. At first, my voice shook, but the more I spoke, the steadier it became. Every sentence felt like opening a window after years of stale air. Ruth didn't interrupt once. Only when I stopped to breathe did she finally speak. Evelyn, she said, do you trust me? Yes, I said without thinking. Good, she replied. Then listen to me carefully. Her tone shifted, professional, protective. You've done the right thing by telling me, but now you need to let me handle it quietly. I don't want trouble, I said. She exhaled softly. You've already had trouble. What you need is proof. Proof? I repeated. Yes, she said. And I can help you get it. I felt a tremor in my chest, part fear, part hope. Ruth, I said, my voice breaking. They come every night. Then we'll be ready for them, she said. Her certainty was like oxygen. After we hung up, I sat in silence again. But it was a different kind of silence this time. It wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. I walked through my house slowly, touching the furniture, the walls. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just waiting. I was planning. When the clock struck 1 a.m. that night, the knock came again. I didn't move right away. I sat there, hands steady, listening. The fear was still there, but it had a new shape. It was no longer control. It was warning. Because they didn't know that I had spoken. They didn't know that someone else finally knew. And they had no idea that the same silence they had used against me was about to become their trap. The knock came at 1 a.m., just like always. But this time I wasn't alone with it. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't stand frozen in the hallway. I sat still, my hands resting on my knees, listening to my own breathing. It was steady. Not calm, but steady. Somewhere nearby, unseen, Ruth was there. That knowledge changed everything. I opened the door slowly. Linda walked in first, her eyes already scanning the room, looking for something to measure. Mark followed, quiet as ever, closing the door behind him with that careful click that used to make my chest tighten. Linda looked at me closely. You look different tonight. I shrugged lightly. Do I? She didn't answer. She sat down, watching me the way people watch something they don't fully trust. Mark leaned against the wall. They spoke. I listened. They hinted. I nodded. They waited. And all the while, my heart stayed strangely steady. Because earlier that evening, Ruth had sat across from me at my small kitchen table. She had arrived quietly, without drama. No uniform, no authority on display. Just a woman with sharp eyes and a calm presence. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. They've been counting on one thing, she said. What? I asked. Your silence. I swallowed. I didn't know what to do. Ruth leaned forward slightly. You did exactly what you needed to do to survive. Now we do something else. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her grip was firm. Evelyn, she said, your age is not a weakness. I looked down. They keep telling me it is. That's because they need you to believe it, she replied. If you doubt yourself, you won't resist. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, recognition. I'm tired, I said quietly. I know, Ruth answered. And that's exactly why we're going to be careful. She explained things slowly, clearly. The way I used to explain procedures to patients who were scared. No rushing. No confusion. Experience matters, she said. You've lived long enough to know patterns. To recognize pressure. To stay still when others rush. She paused. You survived years of night shifts, emergencies, loss. You can survive this. Her words didn't erase my fear, but they gave it shape. You don't need to confront them, she continued. You just need to let them be who they already are. I nodded slowly. They come every night. And they'll keep coming, she said, because they think they control the situation. She looked at me carefully. Do you understand what that means? I thought about it. It means, I said slowly, they won't change. Ruth smiled faintly. Exactly. Back in the living room, Linda talked about stress and concern. Mark nodded at the right moments. It was the same routine, the same tone. But something was different. I noticed details I had missed before. How Linda avoided looking at Mark when she made certain statements. How Mark watched me more closely when money was mentioned. How both of them grew impatient when I didn't respond right away. Age sharpens observation when fear stops blinding you. After they left that night, Ruth stepped out of the shadows. You did well, she said. I didn't do anything, I replied. You did, she said. You stayed steady. The next day, Ruth returned. We talked again. And again. She didn't tell me what to feel. She reminded me of what I already knew. You're not confused, she said. You're not helpless. You're not alone. Those words settled deep. Over the next days, I noticed changes in myself. I slept a little longer. I drank my tea without shaking. I stopped apologizing for my own thoughts. Linda noticed too. You've been quieter, she said one night. I'm listening, I replied. Mark frowned slightly. Ruth explained why that mattered. When people rely on control, she said, they grow nervous when it stops working. They'll push harder, I said. Yes, she nodded. And that's when truth shows itself. One evening before 1 a.m., Ruth sat beside me again. Whatever happens tonight, she said, remember this. You are not weak for being scared. You are strong for surviving it. I looked at my hands. The same hands that had worked for decades. The same hands that had held fear and still kept going. I don't want revenge, I said. Ruth nodded. Good. This isn't about revenge. What is it about then? Ending it. When the knock came, I stood up smoothly. I opened the door. Linda smiled. Good evening, Mom. I met her eyes. Good evening. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, uncertainty. They sat, they spoke. And for the first time in years, I listened without shrinking. Inside me, something stood tall. Not anger. Not rage. Certainty. I knew who I was. I knew what I had lived through. And I knew that age, this age they tried to use against me, had given me patience, memory, and the courage to wait for the right moment. The night ended the same way it always did. But the balance had shifted, because I was no longer counting how much I could endure. I was counting how much longer the truth would stay hidden. The balance had shifted. I could feel it the moment the door closed behind them that night. The house didn't feel lighter, but it felt steadier. Like something fragile had finally found its footing. Ruth didn't speak right away. She stood near the corner of the room, listening to the quiet settle. Then she looked at me. Next time, she said softly, we let the night speak for itself. I nodded. My throat felt tight, but my hands were steady. The next evening moved slowly. I made dinner and barely touched it. I cleaned dishes I didn't need to clean. I sat in my chair and watched the clock without counting minutes. When the time came, Ruth adjusted something small near the shelf. Nothing noticeable, nothing loud. She moved with care, like a nurse preparing a patient without alarming them. You don't need to say anything different, she told me. Just let them be themselves. That sentence stayed with me. At exactly 1 a.m., the knock came. Same rhythm, same confidence. I opened the door, and Linda walked in as if nothing in the world had changed. Mark followed, eyes already scanning the room. Mom, Linda said, we were worried you didn't answer right away. I was in the kitchen, I replied calmly. She nodded, unconvinced, and sat down. Mark stood near the wall, arms crossed. They began the same way they always did, talking in circles, using careful words that sounded kind if you didn't listen closely. You've seemed forgetful lately, Linda said. This house is a lot for one person, Mark added. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. Linda leaned forward. We don't want anyone else getting involved. That was always the signal. Mark cleared his throat. You know what helps. I stood up slowly and walked toward the drawer. My heart beat faster, but I didn't let it show. I counted the money, my movements careful and deliberate. When I handed it over, Linda took it without hesitation. You're doing the right thing, she said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Ruth stayed silent. The night continued like that. Threats wrapped in concern, pressure dressed as care, words layered over words, building something heavy and undeniable. I noticed details again. The way Linda's tone sharpened when I hesitated. The way Mark stepped closer when money changed hands. The way they spoke more freely, more openly, when they thought no one else was listening. Because they didn't think anyone was. That was the power of the night they relied on. They talked longer than usual. This can all be avoided, Linda said. We just need cooperation, Mark added. I nodded. Inside me, a strange calm grew. Because the silence was no longer empty. It was remembering. After they left, Ruth stepped forward. They said enough, she whispered. I exhaled slowly, like I had been holding my breath for hours. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Each time, Linda and Mark grew more comfortable, less careful. Their words sharper, clearer. The threats less hidden. They repeated themselves, confident that repetition would wear me down. They didn't know repetition was working in a different way. Each night, the silence listened. Each night, it kept record. Each night, it held on to their voices. I started noticing something else, too. Linda no longer looked me in the eyes when she talked about doctors. Mark no longer pretended it was about concern. It's easier this way, he said one night. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. One evening after they left, I sat alone in my chair. Ruth stood nearby, checking something small, then nodding to herself. People tell the truth when they think they're safe, she said quietly. I looked at the door. They think the night belongs to them. She shook her head. Not anymore. The fear I had lived with for 3 years didn't disappear. But it changed shape. It wasn't controlling me anymore. It was warning them. When the knock came again, Linda sounded impatient. Open the door, Mom. I did. They walked in, unaware that their words were no longer disappearing into the dark. They spoke. They pressured. They threatened. And the silence did exactly what it was meant to do. It listened. That night, the knock came harder than usual. Not louder, harder, impatient, demanding. I stood up slowly, smoothing my robe, steadying my breath. My hands were calm now. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer owned the room. I opened the door. Linda walked in first, her steps sharp. Mark followed, closing the door behind them with that same careful click. The sound didn't scare me anymore. Linda didn't sit. We need to talk, she said, irritation already in her voice. Mark took his place near the wall. His eyes moved quickly around the room, stopping briefly at places he had never noticed before. You've been difficult lately, Linda continued. Quiet. I met her gaze. I've been listening. That seemed to unsettle her. She crossed her arms. You know what happens when people don't cooperate. I nodded slightly. You've told me. Mark stepped forward. Then let's not waste time. I turned toward the drawer. Linda relaxed just a little. The routine was returning, she thought. Control settling back into place. That's when Ruth stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply walked out of the shadows and into the light. Good evening, she said calmly. Linda froze. Mark's face drained of color. Who is that? Linda snapped, turning toward me. Ruth answered before I could. My name is Ruth. She took out her badge slowly, deliberately, holding it where both of them could see. I'm with the police. The room went silent. Mark took a step back. This is a misunderstanding. Linda laughed nervously. Mom, what is this? Ruth didn't move. You've both been recorded. Linda's eyes widened. Recorded? That's impossible, Mark said quickly. She's confused. Ruth tilted her head slightly. Is she? Linda turned to me, her voice sharp. Mom, tell her this is a joke. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. The woman who had stood in my doorway for 3 years and filled my nights with fear. No, I said softly. It's not. Mark's jaw tightened. You can't prove anything. Ruth nodded once. We don't need to argue about that right now. She reached into her pocket. You're both under arrest. Linda's voice rose. For what? For harassment, Ruth replied evenly. And coercion. Mark shook his head. This is ridiculous. Ruth stepped closer. You can explain everything at the station. Linda looked around the room wildly. Mom, you don't know what you're doing. I felt my chest rise and fall slowly. I know exactly what I'm doing. Ruth guided them toward the door. Linda resisted for a moment, then stopped when Ruth's hand tightened just slightly on her arm. As they were led out, Linda turned back to me. You'll regret this, she said. I didn't answer. The door closed. The lock clicked. But this time the sound felt different. I sat down slowly, my legs weak, not from fear, but from release. Ruth came back inside and sat across from me. You did well, she said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the night was still. The street looked the same as it always had. But inside my house, something had finally broken free. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. The silence after they were taken away felt unreal. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. Not deeply, not peacefully, but without fear waiting at 1 a.m. When morning came, I woke slowly, unsure if what had happened was real. It was. Ruth returned later that day and sat with me at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had changed. They're denying everything, she said gently. I nodded. I had expected that. They always do, she continued, especially when control slips away. Days passed, then weeks. The routine of nights was replaced by paperwork, meetings, waiting. I had always known hospitals ran on patience. Courts do too, but patience feels different when your life is being spoken about by strangers. The day of court arrived quietly. No dramatic entrance, no noise. Just a building that smelled of paper and old air, and a room filled with faces that did not know me. I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap. Linda didn't look at me. Mark stared straight ahead. When they spoke, their voices were confident. They denied everything, every visit, every threat, every dollar. This is all exaggerated, Mark said. She's confused. Linda nodded quickly. My mother has been unstable for a long time. That word again, unstable. It landed heavier in that room than it ever had in my house. She forgets things, Linda continued. She imagines threats. She needs help. I felt my chest tighten. For a moment, I wondered if the room believed her. If the calm tone, the steady voice, the familiar word daughter carried more weight than my years of quiet survival. They spoke about concern, about worry, about how hard it is to care for someone like that. I sat still. Ruth had told me this might happen. They'll try to move the spotlight, she had said. From what they did to who you are. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I am 67 years old, I said calmly. I lived alone. I worked for decades. I managed my life until fear was introduced into it. Linda shook her head slightly as if disappointed. She doesn't understand, she said softly to the court. That hurt more than anger ever could. I sat back down, my heart beating hard but steady. Ruth stood next. She didn't speak about feelings. She spoke about facts. Dates, times, patterns. She spoke with the same calm authority she had carried into my living room. Then she paused. And there is evidence, she said. The room shifted. Linda's posture stiffened. Mark's jaw tightened. Ruth looked toward the judge. With permission, we'd like to play the recording. Linda stood up suddenly. This is unfair. The judge raised a hand. Sit down. The room went quiet. The recording began. At first it was just sound. Footsteps, chairs moving. Familiar voices. Then words. Threats wrapped in calm tones. Pressure spoken like advice. Money demanded without shame. Linda's voice filled the room. Mark's followed. I closed my eyes. Not because I couldn't bear it, but because I had lived it. Gasps moved through the room. Heads turned. Pens stopped moving. Linda's face drained of color. Mark stared at the table. The recording didn't rush. It didn't exaggerate. It simply told the truth. When it ended, the silence felt different from any silence I had known before. This one was shared. Ruth spoke again. These recordings were taken on multiple nights. The judge nodded slowly. Linda tried to speak. She provoked us. Mark added quickly. It was a joke. A joke. The word fell flat. The judge looked at them for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward me. I met his eyes. I didn't plead. I didn't apologize. I simply existed. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The silence after the recording ended did not rush to fill itself. It stayed. It pressed gently against everyone in the room. Like a truth that no longer needed explanation, I sat still. My hands folded the same way they had been folded for hours, maybe years. Only now they weren't shaking. The judge leaned back slightly, eyes still on Linda and Mark. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The room had already heard enough. Linda cleared her throat. Your Honor, she said, her voice softer now, careful. This doesn't show the whole picture. The judge raised his hand. You will speak when addressed. Mark shifted in his seat. He looked toward the floor, then toward Ruth, then away again. The confidence he had carried into the room had drained from him, leaving behind something thin and uncertain. Ruth stood up again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She testified the way she always did, steady, clear, patient. She spoke about patterns, about timing, about repetition. She explained how fear works when it is used slowly over time. How pressure doesn't need shouting to be effective. How control can look calm on the surface while causing damage underneath. These visits occurred at the same hour, Ruth said. Night after night. Over years. She paused, then continued. The money exchanges were not gifts. They were responses to threats. Linda shook her head. She misunderstood. Ruth turned toward her, calm but firm. The recordings show no misunderstanding. She turned back to the judge. They chose the night because it isolates, Ruth said. They used authority language to cause doubt. And they targeted age to create fear. The judge nodded slowly. I watched his face, not hoping, not begging, just watching. When Ruth finished, she returned to her seat beside me. She didn't touch my arm. She didn't whisper reassurance. She didn't need to. The truth was standing now. On its own. The judge addressed Linda and Mark. You both stated earlier that this was a joke, he said. Neither of them responded. You also stated the complainant was mentally unstable. Linda looked up quickly. She is... The judge raised his hand again. The recordings contradict that claim. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Mark tried once more. We were helping her. The judge looked at him. Help does not arrive at 1 a.m. with threats. That sentence settled heavily in the room. I felt something loosen in my chest. For years, my fear had lived only inside me. Now it had been spoken out loud. And it had been recognized. The judge glanced through his notes, then looked up again. The evidence is consistent, he said. The testimony is clear. He paused, letting the words land. This court finds that the complainant's account is credible. Credible. I breathed in slowly. Linda stared straight ahead. Mark rubbed his hands together nervously. The judge continued. This matter will proceed to sentencing. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in relief, not in victory, but in recognition. I had been heard. Not as a daughter. Not as an old woman. Not as someone to be managed. But as a person. When the session ended, Ruth stood beside me as we walked out of the courtroom. You did nothing wrong, she said quietly. I nodded. I know. And that knowledge felt like something solid I could finally stand on. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because everything was over, but because the weight of doubt had been lifted. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could choose. The courtroom was quiet again when we returned. Not the heavy silence of fear, the patient silence of waiting for truth to be named. The judge took his seat and looked down at his notes one last time. Linda and Mark stood side by side, close enough to touch, yet far apart in the way fear separates people. I sat still, my back straight, my hands resting easily in my lap. For the first time in years, my body was not bracing for anything. The judge cleared his throat. "This court finds the defendants guilty," he said, his voice steady, "of harassment and coercion over an extended period of time." Linda's breath caught. Mark closed his eyes. The judge continued. "The evidence shows a pattern of intentional pressure, repeated threats, and forced transfer of money over 3 years. 3 years." Hearing the time spoken out loud felt strange. So much life had passed inside that number. "For these crimes," the judge said, "each defendant is sentenced to 7 years in prison." The words did not hit me like a wave. They settled gently. 7 years. I did not feel joy. I did not feel anger. I felt something quieter. Finality. Linda turned toward me, her face pale. For a moment, I saw confusion there. Not guilt, not regret, just confusion. As if she could not understand how control had slipped away so completely. Mark said nothing. The judge finished speaking, and the sound of the gavel marked the end. It was over. As we stood to leave, Ruth placed her hand lightly on my back, not to guide me, not to steady me, but to acknowledge me. Outside the building, the air felt open, wide. I took a slow breath and let it fill my chest completely. No one was waiting at my door tonight. No one would knock at 1 a.m. again. I returned home that evening alone. The house greeted me the same way it always had, but it felt different now. The walls did not feel like witnesses anymore. They felt like shelter. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. The sound of the lock clicked once, clean and final. I stood there for a moment, listening. No footsteps. No knock. No waiting. Just quiet. I walked through each room slowly, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the table, the window frame. I turned on lamps I hadn't turned on in years. I opened curtains I had kept closed. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights glow. At 67, I had started a new life. Not a loud one. Not a rushed one. A life without fear of being taken. A life without listening for footsteps in the dark. A life without doubting my own mind. I thought about everything age had given me. Patience. Endurance. The ability to wait. The courage to speak when silence no longer protected me. Age had not made me weak. It had taught me when to be still and when to stand. That night, when I went to bed, I didn't set a light on in the hallway. I didn't check the lock twice. I didn't watch the clock. I slept deeply. And when morning came, sunlight filled my room the way it used to, soft, unafraid, honest. I sat up, placed my feet on the floor and smiled. Because this time, the quiet was mine.